Welcome to Episode 8 of Followers of the Cross podcast. This is your host, Jason Reynolds. This episode is coming out around Memorial Day. I'd like to say thank you to all military personnel for your service and sacrifice. Today's podcast is appropriate as Father's Day approaches. I'd like to say thank you to all fathers who are engaged in their children's lives. Ignore the negative messages on fatherhood that our modern society is throwing out. Stay the course in leading your family. I'd like to thank my listeners and offer to chat with you. My email address is journalnewsroom@gmail.com. That's journal, Journal, newsroom@gmail.com. My blog is hosted at Spreaker.com, Spreaker. My blog is at followersofthecross.com. The podcast is also available on iTunes. Today's episode is a must for men everywhere and the women who love their men and sons. My guest is Kent Evans. He has launched a small group movement for men called the Manhood Journey. The Manhood Journey teaches men and boys of all ages how to be mentors. Small group materials will soon be available. Kent also is launching a book June 1st called Wise Guys. He shares the stories of 16 men who made a difference in his life. These men were crucial in helping him after his parents divorced when he was a teenager. Now to the program. Tell me a little bit about your background, and some of the material I read mentioned the fact that some childhood experiences that you had have played into the concept of building a strong family, both from a marriage perspective and from a parenting perspective. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was in a family that was pretty typical, kind of middle-class family. And Dad was hardworking, Mom was hardworking, and they went through a divorce when I was in 17 or 18 years old, and that was pretty traumatic for me. And one of the things that came out of that was a counseling session with a guy who was super helpful, and he listened to me and then finally said, Kent, you seem to be really focused on what you're not going to be when you grow up. Like, you're not going to end up where your mom and dad ended up and all that, and you're pretty angry. And I said, yeah, that's pretty true. And he said, well, you cannot become something. And it was like this moment where the phrase, it hit me, but I didn't fully understand it. And so I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, your brain does not know how to not become something. Like, it's chemically impossible for you to program your brain to not be the thing you don't want to be. And I said, so what's the answer? And he said, well, you need a picture of who it is you do want to be when you grow up. And I said, where do you suggest I go get that picture? And he said, well, from people in your life, from like other men and women that you meet along the way. Start to figure out what they do that you like and what they have that you might want, whether that's better command over money, or they're better looking, or they have a better golf game, or whatever you want. Find out what that is and become a learner of others, from others. And that really altered the course of my life in a way that was really significant. And so I'm now in my mid-40s, and for the last almost 30 years, I've been kind of about that business of, I want to have a really good, godly marriage. I want to be a godly dad, all these things that I want to be. So I get around those people who are like that, and it's like Scripture tells us, iron sharpens iron. One man sharpens another. A companion of fools suffers harm, but a companion of the wise grows wise. And so that's been a real changing dynamic in my life.
Okay. There are at least a couple of different ways that a person can respond to a situation, a background, whatever, especially something traumatic that happens earlier in life. And that's either to do something similar to what you did and try to grow and not become, like your parents, or like, whatever the situation is, or not to blame your past, not to blame your circumstances, what happened, not to be the victim in some cases. To me, that's one option, and then the other option is to say, okay, well, I'm a victim, this thing happened to me, and that kind of
Sure.
defines me. So anytime I come across a situation where somebody says, okay, that thing in the past is not going to define me, I say, yeah, that's great advice.
Well, and I'm kind of with you in that I've found that I do. I kind of look at the world in the same lens. It's funny you say that. There's two kinds of people. There's victims and there's overcomers. And it's not that I was my own bootstraps and I did all this. I really think God's mercy led me to the place of not being a victim. But man, that's a very difficult mental paradigm to shake yourself of, especially as you get older.
Exactly. And talk a little bit about how you have come to build a lasting marriage and a little bit of your general philosophy for raising your sons.
Yeah, so I have 4 boys right now. They're 16, 14, 12, and 4 years old, and we are in the process of our second adoption from Ethiopia, and that'll be, in fact, we were literally pricing flights today, so there's a good chance we'll be in Ethiopia within the next month or two.
Wow.
And so we have 5 boys, and they'll range from a couple years old to 16. And, you asked about sort of maybe my approach to marriage or parenting. Well, I would say that I love the way you asked the question because, in my view, that's the order they need to be in. In other words, I have a much better shot at being a godly father if first I'm a godly husband. And I see a lot of guys trying to compensate for maybe not being a very committed husband by being the world's best devoted father. And it's sad. It's kind of like trying to get somewhere by sitting out in a parking lot, but you're not sitting in a car. You're just going to sit in the parking lot. And you're thinking, I'm going to get there. And you've forgotten the most important ingredient. If you can do it, if your wife is alive, and becoming a godly father is a whole lot easier when there's not a ton of marital friction on the line. And so, not that my wife and I have not had any friction. We've been married. We just celebrated our 21st wedding anniversary, and we've had ups and downs like anybody. But what I've always recognized is that I have a very simple sort of 4-part life mission, and it's only about 8 or 9 words. The first thing is love God. The second thing is serve April. That's my wife's name, April. The third thing is disciple my sons. And then the fourth thing is bless others. And usually, Jason, if I get those in the right order, they're not easy, right? It's not simple,
right.
But it's easier. It's easier and simpler, more simple if those are in the right order. And so I just have focused on my marriage. I have an amazing, godly, faithful, disciplined, hardworking, encouraging wife. And so she makes it easy for me to love her. And then I have boys who have all been open and pliable and responsible. And so, I've been dealt a good hand in the sense of a wife and kids who make it easy for me to plug in and do my thing as a dad.
Excellent. And now going from that background of who you are and your basic relationships, tell me a little bit about your ministry and the book that you have out now.
Sure. So the ministry really preceded the book. The ministry is called Manhood Journey, and the intent of Manhood Journey is to help fathers build the next generation of godly men. We often call ourselves biblical fatherhood catalysts, and the word catalyst is important. We're not just the educators. We don't have all the answers, but what we're going to do in the course of Manhood Journey is put fathers and sons together around a kitchen table or a coffee table in a living room in groups of 5 or 10, 15, and they're going to talk about Scripture. And that's what happens in a Manhood Journey group. If you dropped into the one I'm leading right now on Monday night, you'd find about 7 or 8 dads and about 12 or 14 boys, and we throw out Scripture, and then we throw out questions. And we have a dialogue with young boys. We have boys in there from ages 8 or 9 up to age 17 or so, and the dialogue is rich and vibrant and not insignificant. It's a blast. And so that's kind of a Manhood Journey group is 10 to 15 fathers and sons sitting around talking about Scripture. And we believe if that happens, lots of other dominoes fall at home that are successive after that. And if dad can be a biblical discourser with his own son, great things happen. So that's Manhood Journey. And then the book, Wise Guys, is basically me telling about 16 or 17 stories of men in my life who have significantly impacted my trajectory as a man. Some guys have been in my life this whole time for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Some I had a momentary lunch with a guy in London, England, and I've only been with him 2 hours my whole life, but man, they were an important couple hours. And it's those stories, and the intent of the book is not just to tell the stories. That's not the main point of the book is not to tell the stories. The main point of the book is to help men go find those wise guys in their own life. I don't want to just tell 16 stories and have people go, "Oh, those are great. I learned these 2 cool things from those guys." That's like getting about half the value out of the book. The other half the value is, who do you know? Who's that guy in your life where you go, "Man, he's got a great marriage," or "Man, he's good with money," or "Golly, that guy is really sharp when it comes to managing a big business." Who are those guys, and do we go get around them and take them to lunch and buy them coffee so that we can learn from the men in our lives?
Sure.
That's the hope.
And that is a biblical concept about who you hang out with, basically.
Well, you know what's interesting, Jason? We tend to teach that to our children, that they're 10, 12, 14 years old, and we're like, "Hey, man, you got to stay away from that bad kid, or you got to watch out for those influences on your life." And then we think when we're 24 or 34, all of a sudden that doesn't matter anymore. And that's not true. That's not true. It's not that I never hang out with people who are not, see life the way I see it. I'm around lots of people who are not in my same sort of philosophical approach. But my closest friends are people who are going to draw me closer to the Lord, closer to godliness, not push me further away. And that doesn't change. Whether you're 12 or 52, that doesn't change.
Excellent. And tell me about the book and the different ministry materials. I looked at your website briefly. Looks like you have different brochures and, well, I think it was called a mapture or something. Tell me a little bit more about the ministry aspect and what you're doing. Looks like on your website there's a map with lots of different locations highlighted.
Sure. So I think there's probably just a couple things that would help most folks kind of get their arms around manhood journey. First, we were a small group ministry. We want to have a small group of 10 to 15 fathers and sons in a home talking through Scripture. We have recently added, and by recently I mean it's not quite released yet, but we're done with the content. Some printing's happening right now on some one-on-one discipleship guides aimed at fathers and sons. So for those guys who have a son and they want to have an opportunity to disciple their son, but they're in a geography where there's not a local manhood journey group nearby, we're providing resources for those guys. And what's been amazing is in the last couple of years, we've honestly not been able to track it too specifically, but there are thousands, and it may be as many as 5 or 6 or 7,000 fathers and sons who have gone through or are currently going through some form of a small group guided by manhood journey curriculum. And we don't have the staff. We just embarked on this journey of the nonprofit world, and God's already been pushing our content all around the country. I think I've seen downloads from 46 different states and 9 foreign countries.
Wow.
And it's not because we're genius marketers. It's because I really believe that deep down, if a guy is a believer or has some kind of moral or ethical code at all, he wants to do right by his sons and his daughters. But in our case, our ministry is aimed at the father-son relationship, and we can help him do that.
Tell me, that's an interesting point you make about father-son relationship. Has that sort of relationship been downplayed in our society over the last few decades with feminism, with gender issues?
I might go a step further and say it's not been downplayed; it's actually been ridiculed. Like I think I don't have great examples off the top of my head, but you show me a guy who is at a work party, an after work party at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, who looks at his watch and says, "Oh man, I said I would go catch my son's baseball game tonight." And he puts down his drink and he heads for the parking lot. You show me the work environment that would encourage that.